This is not a gun decision.
No.
It's not. This was not decided on Second Amendment grounds.
This is an issue that every gun owner should be concerned about, and we in Congress should be concerned about it too.
Will allow scrutiny for all gun laws pertaining to everything: assault weapons, age restrictions, restrictions on magazines.
Major decision from the Supreme Court that could have larger implications on gun laws nationwide.
Government may not regulate individuals' possessions of weapons for self-defense.
January 2026 is bringing a gun law to California that's about to devastate an entire industry, bankrupt small business owners who've served their communities for decades, and leave millions of gun owners facing impossible choices. While politicians claim this is about safety, what's actually happening behind the scenes at gun shops across the state tells a completely different story, and the consequences go far beyond what anyone's talking about publicly. Right now, at this very moment, gun shop owners across California are having conversations they never thought they'd need to have. Conversations about closing doors permanently, about walking away from businesses they've built over 30 years, about telling loyal customers that the services they've relied on simply won't exist anymore. The panic isn't just among buyers, it's hitting the dealers even harder. And what they're saying privately reveals just how catastrophic this situation has become. One firearms dealer in Sacramento recently described his predicament. He's processed firearm transfers for 3 decades without any major compliance issues. His business has been a cornerstone of responsible gun ownership in his community, but this incoming law requires him to essentially demolish his entire record-keeping infrastructure and rebuild it from scratch. The price tag for that rebuilding? Around $20,000. New software systems, comprehensive staff retraining, ongoing compliance consulting just to meet the new legal requirements. For a small operation that handles maybe 200 component transfers annually, the mathematics simply don't work. The revenue doesn't justify the investment. He's not alone in facing this calculation. Smaller federal firearms license holders, the mom and pop shops that provide personalized service and deep local expertise, are staring at extinction. Meanwhile, larger retail chains with multiple locations can distribute those compliance costs across much higher transaction volumes. They'll survive. The little guys who actually know their customers by name, who take time to educate first-time buyers, who serve as community resources, they're being systematically eliminated by administrative burden. The firearms dealers who do choose to push forward and stay in business are already planning dramatic fee increases because they literally have no alternative path. When each individual transaction suddenly requires 3 times the paperwork and exposes the dealer to exponentially higher liability risks, those costs get passed directly to consumers. Industry insiders are projecting that transfer fees between $100 and $150 will become the new baseline standard. That's on top of existing state fees. Consider someone building a custom rifle who needs 3 or 4 separate components. They're looking at $500 in pure transfer fees before they've paid a single cent for the actual parts themselves. The dealers who survive this regulatory onslaught won't be the ones who best serve their communities. They'll be the ones who can afford legal teams and dedicated compliance officers. But there's another dimension to this crisis that almost nobody's discussing publicly. California is about to accidentally create an artificial shortage of firearm components across the entire state. Major online retailers like Brownells, Midway USA, and Primary Arms have already announced they're completely reassessing whether they'll continue shipping to California addresses at all. The compliance burden of navigating which specific parts require FFL transfers under the new legal definitions is so Byzantine and complex that many companies are making a simpler business decision. Just stop shipping to California entirely. It's easier to lose that market segment than to risk massive legal liability for accidentally shipping a regulated component directly to a consumer. This creates immediate scarcity on a massive scale. California has approximately 40 million residents and represents roughly 12% of the entire United States population. When major suppliers abandon that market, the remaining dealers who still accept California-compliant transfers become bottlenecks choking the entire supply chain. Distribution networks that functioned smoothly for decades will collapse into dysfunction virtually overnight. Competitive shooters who cycle through barrels regularly, gunsmiths who need replacement parts for customer repair jobs, hobbyists who genuinely enjoy building firearms as a craft, all of them will face delays measured in weeks or months instead of days. Certain parts will become effectively unobtainable. Obscure or older firearm models that already have limited parts availability will be impossible to maintain properly. If you own a vintage rifle and need to replace a broken extractor or firing pin, Finding a California dealer willing to process the transfer paperwork for a $15 part becomes a nearly impossible task. The secondary market for used components will either move completely underground into illegal territory or simply disappear entirely, leaving gun owners with fewer options than they've ever had. Here's the question that should be keeping people awake at night. When government makes it this administratively difficult to maintain firearms you already legally own, is that genuinely about public safety? Or is the actual goal to make gun ownership so frustrating and expensive that people eventually just give up? Everyone's currently focused on January 2026, when the law technically takes effect, but the real catastrophe arrives 18 months later, when background checks and full registration requirements activate in July 2027. Dealers are going to be completely overwhelmed and unprepared for the transaction volume. California's Department of Justice system for ammunition background checks already crashes regularly under current operational loads. Now imagine adding every single component transaction to that same fragile system. The first 6 months after July 2027 will be absolute chaos on a scale the state hasn't prepared for. Transaction times that should take mere minutes will stretch to hours because the system is down or completely overwhelmed by demand. You'll drive to pick up a part you ordered weeks earlier. The dealer will attempt to run your background check through the state system. The system will time out. You'll be told to return tomorrow. Then tomorrow arrives, and the exact same thing happens again. We witnessed this precise pattern when ammunition checks first launched. Gun stores had lines stretching out the door and wrapping around the block. People waiting 2 hours just to purchase a single box of ammunition. Dealers frantically calling DOJ helplines that nobody answered. Now multiply that scenario by every component purchase across the entire state. Some dealers are already announcing plans to limit component transfers to specific designated days of the week just to manage workflow, meaning you can't simply walk in when you need something. You have to schedule around their arbitrary restrictions. Other shops are implementing appointment-only systems where you book a time slot weeks in advance. This isn't customer service. This is government-mandated rationing disguised as regulation. And when the system inevitably crashes during peak periods like hunting season or competition preparation time, you'll be completely out of luck with zero recourse and no timeline for when the problem might be fixed. California has always maintained a hostile stance toward home-built firearms, but this law functionally ends that practice for the overwhelming majority of people. Building your own AR-15 or 1911 used to be a genuinely rewarding hobby. You'd research parts, shop for quality components, assemble everything yourself, and end up with a custom firearm you truly understood inside and out. That entire culture is being systematically destroyed. Every major component now requires an FFL transfer with separate background checks and registration. Your lower receiver, background check. Your upper receiver, another background check. Your barrel, yet another background check. By the time you've acquired all necessary parts through the official process, you've gone through 5 or 6 separate background checks, paid $600 in transfer fees, waited weeks for each component to clear the system, and you've been logged in a government database 6 times for building a single firearm. Compare that to simply buying a complete rifle off the shelf. Same background check, same registration, one transaction, significantly lower total cost. The economic incentive to build your own has been completely and deliberately eliminated, but the damage goes deeper than economics. Home building taught people genuine firearms competency. You learned how the action functions, how to diagnose mechanical problems, how to perform proper maintenance. That knowledge created safer and more responsible gun owners. California doesn't want educated gun owners who understand their tools. They want dependent consumers who don't understand their own firearms and must rely on gunsmiths for every minor issue. The entire DIY gun community that fostered innovation, skill development, and deep understanding of firearms mechanics is being systematically dismantled through bureaucratic red tape. Some people assume they can dodge these restrictions by purchasing components when they travel out of state. Nevada is right next door. Arizona isn't far. Maybe you take a road trip and stock up on parts while you're there. Here's why that strategy won't work and will actually put you at serious legal risk. California makes it explicitly illegal to import these components without going through a California FFL. Even if you legally purchased a barrel in Nevada, you cannot legally bring it back into California unless you ship it to a California dealer and complete the full transfer process. The penalties for violating this are severe. If caught bringing components across state lines without proper transfer documentation, you're facing misdemeanor charges at minimum, with potential felony charges if prosecutors decide to pursue unlicensed dealing allegations. California operates actual border inspection stations on major highways where they stop vehicles and check for agricultural products. Do you genuinely believe they won't expand that enforcement to firearms components once this law is fully operational? Some people will risk it anyway, gambling they won't get caught. but understand you're committing a crime that could result in permanent loss of firearms rights, a criminal record, and thousands in legal fees. For most people, that risk calculation doesn't make sense. Professional gunsmiths are getting devastated by this law in ways most people haven't even considered yet. When you bring your firearm in for repair or customization, the gunsmith needs parts, replacement springs, extractors, firing pins, potentially barrels or receivers, depending on the scope of work. Under current law, gunsmiths maintain parts inventory and can install whatever is needed. Starting July 2027, every component that goes into your firearm might need to be transferred through the background check system with you listed as the buyer. Consider the absurdity of this process. You drop off your rifle for a routine repair. The gunsmith diagnoses a broken extractor that costs $5 to replace. But before he can install it and fix your rifle, you have to come back to the shop, go through a background check to purchase that $5 extractor, wait for DOJ approval, which could take days, then he can finally install it, and you can retrieve your firearm. What should be a 2-day repair becomes a 2-week ordeal. Many gunsmiths are planning to exit the California market entirely. Custom builders who create high-end competition rifles or collectible pieces are relocating to Arizona, Nevada, Texas. The expertise is leaving the state because it's become functionally impossible to practice the craft under these restrictions. What remains will be basic repair shops that don't specialize in anything complex. If you own a unique or custom firearm, finding someone in California with the skills to work on it properly will become extremely difficult. California officials will insist they're not creating a gun registry. But let's be brutally honest about what's actually being constructed. Starting July 2027, every component transaction includes your personal information, the specific item you acquired, serial numbers if applicable, the date of transfer, and the dealer who processed it. That information flows into a DOJ database that's stored indefinitely. They claim it's just for eligibility verification, but once that data exists in digital form, it can be searched, analyzed, cross-referenced, and used for any purpose future lawmakers decide. The California DOJ already maintains the Armed Prohibited Person System, which cross-references firearm ownership records with criminal and mental health databases to identify people who became prohibited after legally acquiring firearms. That system relies entirely on registration data. Now extend that model to every component. They'll know everyone who's building AR-15s, who's buying high-capacity components, who's acquiring parts that might be banned in future legislation. When California inevitably passes new restrictions down the line, they'll have a ready-made, comprehensive list of everyone who owns the targeted items. This exact pattern happened with SKS rifles in the 1990s. California required registration, then later banned certain configurations, and used those registration records to demand surrender or confiscation. Anyone who believes this component registry won't eventually be used the same way is fooling themselves about political realities. There are legitimate steps California gun owners can take right now, before January 2026, to prepare for this regulatory disaster. First, stock up on components while you still legally can. If you own platforms that use interchangeable barrels or uppers, buy spares immediately. Order online, have them shipped directly to your door, and store them properly. Once January arrives, that option vanishes permanently. This is your last window to acquire parts without government paperwork. Second, establish relationships with local dealers who are planning to continue component transfers. Find out their fee structures, their appointment processes, their expected wait times. Building that relationship now means you won't be scrambling when you actually need a part urgently. Ask them directly how they plan to handle the new requirements and whether they're genuinely committed to staying in business long term. Third, consider accelerating any build projects you've been planning. If you've been thinking about building a custom rifle or pistol, do it now while you can still order components freely. Complete all your builds before the law makes the process prohibitively expensive and time-consuming. Every day you delay is money you'll lose in future transfer fees. Fourth, document everything you currently own. Photograph your firearms, components, and parts inventory. Create detailed records of what you have, when you acquired it, and where it came from. If there's ever confusion about pre-law ownership versus post-law acquisition, having documentation protects you legally. Store these records securely, both digitally and in hard copy form. Fifth, join or financially support organizations actively challenging this law in court. The Firearms Policy Coalition, Californians for Second Amendment Rights, and others are preparing extensive litigation. They need funding and plaintiffs willing to stand up. If you're directly impacted by this law, consider being part of the legal fight. These organizations represent your best hope for overturning this unconstitutional mess before it becomes permanently entrenched. But here's the fundamental question everyone should be asking. If you have to rush to exercise your constitutional rights before the government makes them functionally impossible, do you really have rights at all, or just temporary privileges they're slowly eroding away? California isn't implementing this in isolation. They're beta testing restrictions that anti-gun states across the country are watching with intense interest. When California implements a new gun control measure, states like Washington, Oregon, New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts take detailed notes. If this component registration system survives legal challenges and becomes operationalized, expect copycat legislation in every blue state by 2028. That's the bigger strategic picture most people completely miss. California isn't just restricting gun rights for Californians. They're pioneering the regulatory framework that will spread nationwide if it's allowed to stand unchallenged. The same incremental approach, the same delayed enforcement designed to avoid immediate legal challenges, the same surveillance infrastructure carefully dressed up as public safety measures. Other states will take California's model and improve on it, close perceived loopholes, tighten the restrictions even further. We're watching the blueprint for nationwide gun registration being constructed in real time. The only thing that stops this from spreading is comprehensive legal victories that establish clear constitutional precedent. Component registration violates the Second Amendment. Prior restraint on constitutional rights is fundamentally unconstitutional. Surveillance states have no legitimate place in America. Without those decisive legal victories, this model spreads everywhere. The fight over California's gun law is just beginning, and every gun owner nationwide should be paying extremely close attention to how this unfolds. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.